Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Leanne Chang, and I'm the content manager for the Specialty Coffee Association. I'm also the staff host for this lecture. Welcome to The Real Deal, the search for authenticity in food and coffee. Before we start, I'd like to thank all the Expo Weekend sponsors, Pacific Barista as the title sponsor, Savor Brands, Chemex, and Roastar as underwriters. Also, just a reminder, please type in your questions into the Q&A tab in the right of the chat tab. So I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Noa Berger. She's a sociology PhD candidate at the EHESS Paris, studying the social construct of quality in the French and Brazilian specialty coffee markets. In addition to her research, she has also written for Our Coffee magazine, 25 magazine, and Standard. So I'll let Noa take it away. Noa, I'm going to stop you real quick. You've actually been muted. We've lost audio for some reason. Sorry about that. Okay, we're working on that right now. Noa, can you say something? No, I still can't hear you. Interesting. Sorry, everyone. If you could hang in for a second as we fix this technical difficulty. Noa, can you try headphones? Thanks, everyone, for your patience. Great. Noa, can you try this again? Cool. Can you try speaking? No. Yeah, maybe try logging out, logging back in real fast. Great. Cool. Great. If everyone could just bear with us for a little longer as we try this out. Great. So I hope everyone has gotten the chance to check out all the lectures that we have right now. If not, go head over to exposeason.coffeeevents.net after this to go register for other ones as well. We have 5 lectures for each of the days, which is pretty amazing. We have great content. And it looks like Noah's back in. Let's see if we could get our audio to work this time.
Can you hear me? Can
Great.
you hear me?
Camera's
Leanne?
on. Yeah, great. That works. Okay, cool.
Okay, you can hear me.
Let Noah take it away. Yes. Can you start from the top,
Perfect.
please?
Sorry, everyone, for the delay. It was working when we joined. All right, so I'll go ahead and start again. Let me see, presenters. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you so much, Heather, who's backstage. We can see her, and Peter, and the rest of the team in the research group here for letting us, have the platform to present a more sociological perspective on coffee. And thank you so much for everyone attending. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. I think also that this pandemic has really destabilized a lot of our preconceived categories we think through. And I really hope that today I can show you that social science can be a very useful tool to apprehend this kind of newfound ambiguity. But I'm not going to talk about COVID, the pandemic. During the next 45 minutes or so, I would like to explain to you how and why we came to be so interested in consuming authentic food and coffee specifically. What I would like to argue today is that the notion of authenticity, despite representing an important organizing symbol in our consumption choices, is also socially constructed, and that it captures very different and sometimes opposing meanings in a way that reveals our tendency to think through dichotomies. I will also argue that these constructions serve or have to do with politics, nationalism and boundaries, economic reasoning, and questions of social class. So what I suggest to do is to first retrace how and why we became so interested in eating and drinking authentically, and show that this process has to do with wider questions concerning modernity and globalization. Then I will argue that authenticity means very, very different things, and that in fact it might, as a consequence, not mean anything. But despite my previous claim, I would also argue that authenticity is power, meaning who and what gets to be defined as authentic implies inclusion, exclusion, and control. All right. Let me begin. Already in the 1930s, Walter Benjamin suggested that we live in the age of the replica. And what was true then, between the Industrial Revolution and the age of supermarkets, is even truer today in the digital age. But even at an age where the copy has been upgraded to a state-of-the-art, we increasingly look for and are sold food and drinks that express authenticity in different forms. What do I mean by that? Authenticity can be expressed, for example, through a valuation of terroir, which in coffee is, like in wine, increasingly protected by designations of origin in producing countries like Brazil. Authenticity is not just about geographical origins and the taste of the land, but also the names, the faces, and sometimes the stories of the producers who made our coffee or our food. This identity, again, can be protected through labels and reports that attest to coffee's authenticity, for example, is organic, is traded fairly, directly, or sustainably. And with the implementation of technologies and systems for traceability and price transparency, the term authenticity takes on even a newer meaning, meaning something that we can authentify. But let me start by asking, why are we so interested in eating authentically? So first thing first, eating authentically, is telling a story. So to understand why we look so much for authenticity in the food that we eat and the drinks that we drink, we have to understand the process through which food and stories became intertwined. And this probably begins at the moment where food becomes a cultural activity, what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has called its own field. Its own field meaning its own little world. Gastronomy is a little world in the galaxy that is food, a world with values such as refinement or quality or authenticity, with stories that we tell about it and judge and esteem according to those criteria. So historian Priscilla Ferguson, you can see the reference in that slide, dates this kind of the beginning of this process of food intertwining with stories to post-revolution France, when the first restaurants began appearing. And not only did restaurants appear when chefs that had to escape the elite's houses, open places where they could cook, but also people started going to those restaurants and writing about food. They started telling stories about food. And those stories were written and read in the new public places that opened at that time. Coffee shops that became even commoner than before, for example. So when we talk about authentic food, we also tell the story of that food and how it came to be. With the growth of and the appearance of the science of the practice of marketing and advertising, this process becomes even stronger of telling stories. And stories in marketing and advertising are used, of course, to make the distinction between similar goods and also to justify higher margins or value, for example. But not only do we tell stories about food, but food also tells a story about us. And when we want to eat authentically, that also qualifies us as a person capable of discerning authenticity, discerning refinement, discerning quality. And again, this process continues with what we see today, and we call in sociology as the cooking of the self. There's a beautiful article I recommend reading that just came out about gastroemotivism. What does it mean to cook the self? It means, for example, this idea that through cooking, we do something that's almost therapeutic. We look for authentic, real, internal self. We cook our biography. We cook our childhood. And not only do we cook, or we try to find this authentic self through cooking, but we perform it. So all of you probably are thinking about reality TV competitions such as MasterChef, Top Chef, even Chef's Table, where this narrative of cooking as a way to, kind of connect with your interiority is performed. We all do it, of course, on Instagram as well, or at least I do. But authenticity concerns something larger than just storytelling, stories that we tell about food or stories that food tells about us. Authenticity has to do with modernity itself. First of all, the search for authenticity is, or has been explained, as a reaction to modernization that includes industrialization, rationalization, technology, and later, digital platforms that create what Max Weber, a German sociologist, described as the disenchantment of the world, this removal of charm and of mystery in a more technological or industrial at the time world. Another sociologist, Georg Simmel, also talked about this as resulting from urbanization and the severance of social bonds. Even before them, Karl Marx, philosopher, sociologist, talked about the concept of alienation. And as supply chains become more and more complex, we lose touch, we become more distant with the origin of the products that we consume, and especially the foods that we eat, distant from their nature and distance from the knowledge of how they were made to be. So telling a story or searching for authenticity in food is also trying to bring back some of that lost charm, that lost enchantment, to reconnect with the world, in a sense, through a story about origins. In the case of complex supply chains, to try and reach or understand or learn more about the origins of the products that we consume. But the search for authenticity is not just about trying to connect to distant origins, it's also about the valuation of the local. And authenticity can be also understood as a counter-reaction to globalization and to the sense of sameness that it brings with it. Sometimes we talk about it even as Americanization. Everything becomes kind of the same. And authenticity in this sense can be explained as trying to draw symbolic boundaries or national boundaries. For example, with designations of origin, deciding that authentic French champagne can only be made in the boundaries of the country whose territory is drawn as France is asserting that some foods are authentically French, are different, and that this difference, this uniqueness, needs to be protected through real physical boundaries, through legal boundaries, and through symbolic boundaries. There is a wonderful article that I really recommend reading. Both articles here are open access, by the way, about the notion of Gastrin nationalism that expands a little bit more on that last point. Now, the case of designations of origin specifically leads me to my next question, which is not just why are we interested in eating authentically, but what do we actually mean when we talk about authentic food? And I'm going to stay with this question of designations of origin and take an example that the article I just cited actually talks about as well, which is the battle over authentic Greek feta. So between 1999 and 2002, Greece struggled over the right to define feta as an authentic Greek cheese, protected as such by the European Union's PDO. PDO means Protected Designation of Origin. So, against Greece, there was a coalition led by Germany and Denmark and supported by France and England. And the arguments of this coalition against protecting feta legally as a Greek cheese were: one, the origin of the word feta is not derived from Greek, but from Italian language. Two, the word feta, according to this coalition, doesn't signify a specific geographical region, unlike Champagne, for example, which is the name of the region where the grapes are grown. Feta cheese, three, is also produced in a region where climate conditions are very diverse and can also be found in other countries. Therefore, they concluded that this cheese doesn't express the taste of the land of Greece, the terroir, and then is not authentically tied to Greek territory. And lastly, they suggested that the term feta has become banal, and that de facto it describes a very wide array of cheeses, not just one product that's unique to Greek culinary culture. Now, the war over feta cheese was in the end won by Greece. What the EU decided is to maintain the legal protection of feta as an authentic Greek cheese, and the reasons they gave were that 85% of the global production of feta and 80% of its consumption were in Greece. And that secondly, even German and Danish cheesemakers who make feta-style cheeses use the colors of the Greek flag and images of Greek landscapes on the packaging of these feta-style cheeses. So, the case of feta raises the question: what is the basis for defining a good as authentic. Is food authentic because it's linked to the history and to the culture of a country or a region? Or rather, is it authentic because it's linked to its land, the earth? Is it authentic because it's produced exclusively by a certain country, or because it's massively consumed there? Now, to continue this point, authenticity doesn't just signify very, very different things, but it can signify meanings that we would maybe define as opposing. Now, usually when we talk about authentic food, we think about this semantic field that also includes artisanal, local, craft, maybe natural. But researchers have shown, and specifically Beverland and Farelli cited here, that even foods and companies that are as far removed as you can imagine from the semantic field will be considered as authentic under certain circumstances. For example, their interviewees sometimes describe McDonald's as authentic, or KFC, or Vegemite, or instant coffee, because they considered that these products were inherent to the traditions and the cultures of the countries where they were made. And if you think about it, perhaps some of you on a trip, if we get to travel again to southern United States, might go and consume fast food as a way to kind of explore and experience the culture of southern United States. So these foods, of course, that are produced in a way that is speedy and industrial and very removed from nature can also be considered as authentic. Now, this actually stems from the fact that in truth, authenticity means very different things. When we talk about an authentic food or person or object or whatever, we can talk about authenticity as nature, and we can talk about authenticity as culture. And this distinction between nature and culture is also related to questions of class, which I will show. When I say authenticity as nature, I mean to say something is authentic because it's true, because it's loyal to its inner core. Easiest example is people that we define as authentic because they're true to themselves, because they express what they mean. But authentic can also be tradition, culture. It can be loyal not to your own inner core, but loyal to something that someone has defined for you. For example, we think about pizza napolitana as made not with Stilton cheese or Roquefort, but mozzarella cheese. Or sushi is supposed to be eaten with chopsticks and not with forks, etc. And there has been an awful lot of research about who gets to access or who gets to enjoy and understand these different meanings of authenticity. Authenticity as nature and authenticity as culture. Which sends us to the question of power. Now, just on a side note, the term authenticity comes from the Greek word authentikos. And authentikos means a narrative, but also implies a narrative that an authority kind of forces upon something or someone else, which to me is very revelatory. So researchers have shown that through, for example, studies of American restaurants, that often natural authenticity will be linked to higher prices and consumption that requires knowledge. What do I mean? Think about Noma, for example. Restaurants that serve these kind of very natural, raw foods. Not only often these kind of restaurants or products would be very expensive, but symbolically, they might require some skills and knowledge and confidence to access and to understand. What the researchers I cited here show, for example, is that in many American restaurants, menus that have like more natural ingredients will also talk about them using terms derived from French, Italian, and Japanese. So you have to have that knowledge, that understanding, and then confidence to access these kind of natural foods. The more traditional authenticity, on the other hand, will be often associated to simpler, more affordable foods. And then you'll see talking about time-tested recipes, for example, and tradition. Now, those distinctions between natural authenticity and traditional authenticity are not just between the high-end and the affordable. I would argue that they also make the distinction between luxury and specialty, which brings us finally to coffee. Sociologist Elizabeth Currid-Halkett has argued that as luxury goods become more and more accessible, right? It's easier today than before to go on a trip, to afford an iPhone, even to go to a good restaurant, or at least to have an imitation that's convincing enough. Global elites have found new ways to separate themselves through consumption. And so there has been a shift of the interest from goods that are simply out of reach because they're expensive to goods that are out of reach because they require an awful amount of knowledge and education. Goods through which we make ourselves better, we optimize ourselves, we grow. And these goods will often be also closer to the production sphere, so further away from us. And here I'm talking clearly about middle upper class consumers in the global north. So from us will be in the production sphere in our case. And so, for example, you take the packaging of chocolate, right? Often the more affordable, but also what used to be more of luxury, high-end chocolate will show images associated with tradition and with the consumption sphere. So as you can see here, you will have cows and jugs of milk and Alpenmilch chocolate and here flowing milk, flags of Switzerland, etc. The specialty, or the bean to bar chocolate, will often have images of the raw material of the cocoa bean or of the coffee bean in the case of coffee, closer to the production sphere. Now, this closeness to the production sphere and to nature is not just in design, it's also in taste, for example, right? Bean to bar chocolate and specialty coffee will often be characterized by tastes that are closer to the fruity taste, more sour tastes that are more acquired, and for example, more affordable or traditional chocolate will have more of the taste of the roasting, of the caramelization, of the sugar, something that can be more accessible. So to understand and access these goods, you do need to have some kind of experience, you do need to have repetitive tasting. This is especially true in the case of tasting notes. There is a lot of discussion about this in specialty coffee, and it's true that to be able, anyone who's tried to describe the wine or the chocolate or the coffee that they're tasting knows that tasting notes take a lot of experience, take a lot of time, and take a lot of confidence. And while on paper, anyone can buy specialty coffee and enjoy it, and anyone can buy a bean to bar chocolate, and anyone can buy a bottle of wine, to truly understand, enjoy, talk, and use these foods as a sort of symbol does require knowing people, does require knowing something, and does require a level of confidence. So what appears to be democratic often has in it distinction. In specialty coffee specifically, though, there is something interesting that I'd like to highlight, which is we move or we look not just for authentic tastes or authentic design, but specialty coffee is also about stories. And so we can talk maybe about a move from authentic food to authentic people. And I mean the stories of the producers that can be commodified and sold as part of what we pay for specialty coffee. Now, in coffee, this is highly complex. because, as some of you might already know, the specialty coffee market emerged more or less around the 1970s in California, in the United States, and at the same time, maybe in other Anglo-Saxon countries. And initially, when the specialty coffee market started forming, it built itself on the wine model. It took the 100-point scoring system, the tasting notes, the wheel of aromas and flavors, but also something else, which is this kind of language or metaphor, which is we sell you not just the product itself, but we sell you a landscape. And just as in wine, you have images of I'll quote Peter here, of rolling hills, covered in vines. In coffee as well, you have these representations of the production sphere, but also of the people that make that coffee. And in the early years of specialty coffee, you would see a lot of that. You would see a lot of those, hands holding red cherries, this beautiful image that was all over. But this is problematic today in coffee. Why? Because unlike wine, that is in a very large generalization produced by and consumed by the same social layer, more or less, socio-economically speaking, coffee has an inherent inequality to it, which is it is often produced by people that are not as well off, economically speaking. And so when we try to represent the people who make that coffee, the producer, it's very, very easy to kind of fall into that trap of either romanticizing poverty by showing the difficulties of coffee producers, or pinkwashing, probably not the right term, reality, by showing cases of success and talking about relationships and camouflaging the very difficult reality that can be behind coffee production in certain countries. So this is something, a facet of authenticity, or how to represent authenticity, that I think the specialty coffee market is struggling with. And that hypothesis might also explain, very partially, why we're seeing a move away from showing images and talking about people and more talking about numbers, or doing coffee packaging that is much cleaner, or doesn't even try to represent stories or in the experience that is specialty coffee. Now let me conclude with a question because we went through it pretty quickly. And the question is, as coffee roasters, as producers, as professionals, and people working in the food industry, what do we want to communicate when we want to present the food that we're making, or the coffee that we're making, as authentic? In which way? And how does that open and close access to certain people? Now, authenticity, as I hope I've shown, can be many, many different things. And so maybe in a way, it's nothing. But at the same time, it does have to do with questions of power, which I hope I showed. And despite these criticisms, I do think that authenticity can be extremely valuable, not as its own end, but as a motor, as a motivation, especially if it leads us to learn more, to know more, and to consume and produce in a way that's more sustainable, ecologically, economically, and socially. Yeah, so in that sense, authenticity is a motor, not an ideal. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. And I think I'll we'll open the floor to questions now. Love to engage a discussion with you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Noah, for that presentation. So we'll start the Q&A. Just remind everyone, if you can put your questions into the Q&A tab, we'll try to get to them depending on the volume. So the first one we have here is from Mariam. She says, hello there. Love this topic. Where do you draw the line between gentrification and being authentic?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Where do you draw the line between gentrification and being authentic? So gentrification and being authentic are not synonyms. They're not the same thing. The relationship between gentrification and authenticity is that gentrification, so for those of you who don't know, because I'm sure there are some who don't, gentrification, first of all, is the process through which areas in the outskirts of the city that are maybe originally less well-to-do are first kind of taken over maybe taken over by young artists, what people call the creative classes, start, being more bourgeois or bobo, we call it as well, or hipster. And this kind of aesthetic or interest in creation leads real estate developers often to come to those neighborhoods, invest, and eventually push out the original residents of those neighborhoods. And it's this process that usually in big cities, capitals, grows from the center to the margins and kind of takes the same look in different cities across the world, from Brooklyn to Paris. And authenticity has a very important role to play in the process of gentrification. There is, for those interested, there is a sociologist called Sharon Zukin who wrote a lot about that. It's not my expertise. And the link between gentrification and authenticity is that it's a big motor for what pulls people towards those neighborhoods that are less well-to-do socio-economically speaking, because it has to do with our fascination with ethnic food, for example, little ethnic restaurants, and how the creative classes, young artists and students often want to or are drawn by this kind of aesthetic and want to be a part of it and recreate it. And this thing that kind of draws people, that becomes alluring, that becomes valued, ends up giving value or artistic value to these neighborhoods, which again raises the prices, attracts the real estate owners, and pushes out the very same people whose authenticity, authenticity attracted those young artists in the same place. And coffee shops specifically have an important role to play in this process. It's a very difficult debate because, again, I'm speaking to you now from a suburb of Paris that is going through gentrification. I moved here myself because I had no choice. I want to live, I need to work in Paris. I don't have the money to live in the center of the city. So I moved here and I'm, part of this process myself. So it's very complex. But what did happen is that a few social scientists, unfortunately, did consult governments that this was a great way, gentrification, to raise the value of neighborhoods and develop the city. And it's a process with, I hope I summed it up well. I know that there are some urban scholars here. Yeah, great. So that's about it for that question.
So the next question from Ryan, with the language used to describe authentic cuisine, could this be viewed as a way to purchase and a way into a higher social class? In a similar way of conspicuous consumption can give an image of being upper class whether or not they are a part of that class?
Okay, that's a great question. And it has to do with what we call in sociology the question of agency, the question of how much we can actually change and evolve and kind of climb that social ladder. Different sociologists will give you different answers. Some will say that the social class is kind of determined and there's not much that you can do, but most do accept that there is some leverage for climbing up that ladder through taste, through knowing how to consume and show that you're consuming more authentically. I came into specialty coffee just a few years ago, into wine as well. I didn't know anything about them. I trained my palate and I got into, it's environments that I managed to get into and progress. But at the same time, for example, myself, I had the tools and the knowledge how to, or the methodology I would call, of how to do those things. So in asking, can you change your social class? The answer is you can play around the game. You can climb up and down the ladder. Of course, there's things that you can do. Not everything is set. But just because you have some power to act, that you have some agency, as we say, doesn't mean that there's no structure. that kind of directs our actions. And just because there is structure doesn't mean that we don't have the will to operate. And conspicuous consumption is something different. It's not to change your social class necessarily. It's more to show it through consumption, to perform it. So that's a little bit of a different question.
Great. Awesome. So this question is from Emma. How
Yes.
can we be authentic while still pushing forward those stories of producers or of origin? Romanticizing seems to dominate these stories. How can we separate the problematic approach?
Good question. So I would say that there's no such thing of being really authentic. I hope that that's what I managed to show through this talk. But in what I think you mean to say, how can we operate in a way that's ethical? There's no good answer. With specialty coffee and other products that are that have colonial origins and existing inequalities, there are no good answers. There is no right way. There's no one right way anyway. But it's, I mean, you can do your best. And if you are working with coffee producers, the only thing I can say is to remember that there is no such thing, the coffee producer. It depends on who you're working with. Some people would like to have their difficulties that they're facing stressed and presented, and some people would like to show the successes that they're achieving. So if you're talking about relationship coffee, then dialoguing with the people whose coffee you're selling is the first step, and they can tell you what they make of it. There is no such thing as the desire of the producer, basically.
Great. So this next question is from Claudia. Could you please expand on how authenticity is to be perceived as a motor, instrumentally, I assume?
How authenticity can be perceived as a motor, I mean by that it's trying to be driven by the idea of knowing the origin or acquiring knowledge about the things that we consume and produce is not in itself a bad thing. The problem, I would say, with authenticity is when we imagine it as some ideal that we have attained or have not attained, and that makes us better than someone else. For me, it's about getting off the horses. So that's what I mean. Authenticity is a motor, is the search or the action of being conscious of acquiring knowledge and understanding, as long as it's accompanied by action.
Great. And this question is from Jocelyn. How can authenticity translate better online? It's hard to cut through all the false authenticity brands used in their online marketing and differentiate your brand as a more truthful and transparent.
That's, again, a very difficult question because it's not always, I mean, even taking the time to really look into what companies are doing and if they're actually respecting their mission statements is a privilege. Most consumers don't have the time and the ability to actually go and read the transparency reports. Or understand what practices are really behind what people are saying on social media. I think that's, I mean, it's impossible for most people. It's possible maybe for those privileged enough to have the time to dedicate to it. So the only, again, I'm not in consultancy here, but however much you can to develop relations and a dialogue with the people that you're buying from and try to look into it, there is a way. And of course, the smaller producers and the smaller vendors are often very much easier to access in that sense than big, conglomerates where there isn't a lot of transparency across the supply chain.
Great. And then the next question is from Caitlin. She says, "Hi, loved your presentation.
Thanks.
I'm an anthropology student and I'm fascinated with how Bourdieu's field theory lines up with how we create value in specialty coffee. How do you think the specialty coffee industry can begin to deconstruct the power structures that tend to dictate what is authentic and valuable?"
What a question. Okay, so I don't know. I can't. It's two different questions. So how to deconstruct is read sociological work, basically. I mean, read sociological work, read about your industry. There's a lot of amazing stuff out there to help you kind of deconstruct the questions of monetary value and symbolic value in the specialty industry. And if you're working within the industry, how you can apply that is difficult for me to say, but you can make at least your choices in a way that's more conscious and hopefully in dialogue. Also, I think what anthropology can help, and I'll give one recommendation that just pops to my head. There's an anthropologist called Ted Fisher. He gave a talk at RICO last year, so it's online on YouTube. And he wrote a wonderful article called Quality and Inequality. That's also open access. You can find it online, where he deconstructs a lot of those questions. The problem, what anthropologists can do that maybe people with the industry can't always do easily, is that they don't just hear what they want to hear. We do our work. I'm sorry, I'm not doing PR for sociology and anthropology, but we are doing our work in a way that's anonymous to the people we talk to. And we just let them talk. We spend a lot of time with them. We speak. I mean, I worked in Brazil. I speak bad Portuguese, but I try. Edward Fisher speaks Spanish, and we spend a lot of time. So if you really want to, understand, then this kind of research is a good place to start. And maybe it will change your perspective a little bit on things as you thought about them before.
Great. And this question is from Alejandro. Hi, Noa. Great talk. Regards from Colombia. Do you consider having transparent and reliable set of metrics of economic and social impact? Does that help building up this authenticity?
So these kind of metrics is something that exists. There's the Transparent Trade Initiative, there's Veritas that does exactly that. They don't do a label, but they do kind of metrics. Myself, as a social scientist, these are not the tools that I develop. I look at them with a critical gaze and try to understand where it's coming from and what it means. But these things exist. I mean, again, this new sense of authenticity is something that is not a story, that is not subjective, but that can be authentified. Now, to me, the discourse or the idea of being able to authentify something is also a story. Doesn't mean that it's not true, but it's a story. It's something that we are interested in, that we value today for different reasons. And it can create very sustainable practices. So yeah, look those initiatives up.
Great. And then this question is from Dean. What role do you think authenticity has in preserving traditions versus stagnating growth?
Whoa, Dean. I think I know which Dean it is. A really hard question. Sustaining or preserving traditions. Both. And that comes back to my suggestion that authenticity can be contradicting things. I don't underestimate how much, 30%, 70%, but definitely the interest in authenticity pushes to kind of the resuscitation of ancestral traditions. You can see people cooking ancient Egyptian recipes. Anthropology, initially, its beginnings are horrible as a colonial science, but there was a period where it was all about preserving and saving authentic indigenous traditions, which is not what we do today. So there is that preserving tradition. Again, it's usually a version of tradition that kind of fits the way we see and what we value today. And at the same time, authenticity is used as a lever for growth in the, let me put a big sociological term, in the sense of the neoliberal ideology, meaning that through consumption, we grow our authentic self. We become better, we optimize a la Silicon Valley. For example, through wine tasting and coffee tasting and cupping, we learn to connect with ourselves, develop our palates, learn something about the terroir of distant places, learn something about ourselves. And this idea of authenticity as growth is neoliberal. When I say neoliberal, I mean this kind of alliance of the therapeutic search for within, the kind of psychological influence, and the capitalist idea of growth. So through searching for your authentic self through consumption, for example, you also grow, you also optimize, you also become better. You take something within and you use it to improve. And that's that serves this kind of neoliberal economic idea of the individual becomes responsible of his own actions, while the state retires more and more from social security and social support, basically.
Great. The next question is from Erica. Hello, Noah from Kenya. Thank you for addressing this complex issue. Would you address the ways that specialty coffee often uses women's stories in particular as a claim towards authentic stories? We see this on coffee bags, coffee names, images, websites, and more. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Wow, thank you. Fascinating. I have to admit, I haven't addressed this and I haven't thought about it enough. The links between authenticity and gender. But what you say makes perfect sense. It has to do, so it sends me back to two things. It sends me back to a very old anthropological idea that I don't know if even is relevant, of the association, the symbolic or cultural association between nature and women and culture and men. There has been really interesting anthropological work, and notably Sherry Ortner, who's shown how in our cultural representations we often like equate the idea of nature, something that is uncontrollable, emotional, maybe even, to the idea of women, to the gendered idea of women, and the idea of culture and control to men. So this link between emotional authenticity and nature and gender could make sense from that perspective, but again, it's becoming kind of dated, this way of thinking, but it's an interesting reference to have. And the second thing it sends me to is the notion of emotional labor. Again, very interesting work. There's a sociologist called Arlie Hochschild that termed this idea of emotional labor, which is, it pertains more to she was talking about the service industry. She was talking about flight attendants, and we can think about baristas, where part of your work, part of what you're paid for, tipped for, is your emotional expression. You can see that also in the production sphere, like often buyers, when they travel to origin, they'll expect not just the coffee, but some kind of hospitality from the producer, and that's what will make them work with someone or not sometimes. So this idea of emotional labor is gendered, because as most of you who have worked at the service industry as women know, what is expected of women regarding emotional expression is not the same that's expected of men. I don't know if you've ever if you're a woman, someone must have told you at least once, why are you not smiling? You're expected to smile, you're expected to perform emotionality in a different way. So this also makes your question make sense in this framework for me as well.
Great. That was a great question.
Yeah.
The next one's from Baba. Hello, Noah. Appreciate your presentation. Do you have any thoughts, given your research, about what producers of either coffee, cacao, and what actually like as the stories or perceptions of who they are? Have you done any work around this?
About the stories of coffee and cacao farmers?
Let me reread that. I think what she means is, are you familiar with any stories or perceptions of who they are with coffee and cacao? The producers of coffee and cacao.
Stories of perceptions of who? I'm not sure I understand the question. I did do research in Brazil recently, spent a few months there, and I interviewed quite a few coffee producers. I'm obviously looking into the perceptions and conceptions of authenticity in the production sphere as well, and the stories that are told. It's a bit long to get into now, seeing that we have 5 minutes, but also in the production sphere, there are, of course, stories that are told and leveraged to kind of qualify and represent coffee as authentic. Sometimes it draws from the natural environment. Sometimes it draws like from the tradition or the story of that region. Sometimes, again, it's like the emotional labor and the story of the producer himself. I hope to publish on that later on. So I did look into it, but it's seeing that we have 4 minutes, I'm not gonna expand fully.
Great, awesome. So with 4 minutes left, we'll have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap this up. So from Chloe, thank you for organizing this talk and sharing your research. I work in food innovation and we want to make more sustainable food. How do we bring authenticity in new fields like plant-based foods?
Again, I'm not promoting bringing authenticity anywhere, and I'm not doing consultancy either in that sense. So I can't completely answer that question. Again, as I said in the end, looking for knowledge, trying to do things ethically is, is a good thing. But I can't give advice on how to, how to do things more authentically. That's the point.
Right. And the last question from Andrew, are you aware of any research that explains who benefits from authenticity, or can you speak to that point? Who wins from authenticity?
So there isn't such a thing as winning or losing from authenticity, but authenticity can be used as a language, as an aesthetic, as a tool to maintain the positions of some or elevate the position of some over others for sure. So yeah, I think I gave some references and examples. For example, Johnston and Bauman wrote a book called Foodies, Democracy and Distinction, in which they show how the language of authenticity kind of is used to ascertain social class. So for example, what they suggest is that foodie practices, foodie being like the passion for simple foods and high-end foods at the same time, valuing all kinds of foods. So this kind of foodie practices basically value food that is considered to be authentic and often exotic or ethnic, which basically defines these foods as a category that's always defined against the mainstream. So when you define something else as like exotic or as authentic, you're basically saying, I'm the one capable of discerning and defining what is authentic and what is exotic. Sharon Zukin's work that I mentioned earlier is a great example of how some can benefit from the language and aesthetic of authenticity, how the state uses the language and aesthetic to attract real estate investors and, make some profits. So yeah, there are a lot of examples.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Noah, for presenting.
Thank you.
That concludes this lecture. Thank you all for attending. We appreciate you taking the time out of your Friday to come and see one of our lectures. We'd also like to thank Pacific Barista as the title sponsor, Savor Brand, Chemex, and Roastar as underwriters for the Expo Weekend Lectures. Also, please be sure to fill out the post-lecture survey following this lecture. And I hope you all have a safe and healthy time wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.